Hey everyone, welcome to this podcast. I'm really glad you're here today. This episode is going to be a little heavier, but it's something that affects how we understand the world around us every single day. We're going to be talking about mass shootings and school shootings, but more specifically, how the media presents these events to us and how that shapes what we believe about them. For most of us, these events don't happen in front of us. They happen through a screen. We experience them through headlines, notifications, and breaking news alerts. Before we get into everything, it's important to understand just how common these events have become. A mass shooting is typically defined as an incident where 4 or more people are shot, not including the shooter. In 2025, there were approximately 408 mass shootings across the United States, according to data from Gun Violence Archive. That means these incidents aren't rare or isolated. They're happening often enough that the way they're reported really matters. I want to give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover in this episode. Most of us don't experience these events directly. Instead, we learn about them through news reports, social media, and online discussions. Because of that, the way these stories are told becomes really important. The media doesn't just give us facts, it also frames those facts in certain ways. In this episode, I'm going to break this down into 3 main topics. First, we'll talk about how the media creates this idea of a typical shooter and how that stereotype shows up again and again. Second, we'll look at how mental illness is often used as an explanation for these events and why that might be misleading or incomplete. And third, we'll talk about sensationalism, basically how the media covers these events in dramatic ways and how that can impact public fear, understanding, and even future incidents. Throughout this episode, I'll also include research and examples to support these points, so it's not just opinion, it's based on data and studies. Before we move into the first topic, I want to take a second to explain why this really matters. The way the media frames mass and school shootings doesn't just affect how we feel in these moments, it shapes how we think long term. It influences what we believe causes these events, who we think is responsible, and what kind of solutions we support. So this isn't just about media. It's about how information shapes public opinion and real-world decisions. Let's start with the idea of the typical shooter. When you think about school shootings or mass shootings that have been covered heavily in the media, there's probably a certain image that comes to mind. And that's not random. That image has been shaped over time by repeated media narratives. A lot of media coverage focuses heavily on the identity and background of the shooter. In many high-profile cases, the shooter is described as a young white male who was socially isolated, bullied, or struggling to fit in. The media often digs deep into their personal life, talking about their childhood, relationships, struggles in school, and sometimes even their online activity. For example, one article described a shooter as a former Marine who suffered from a traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder, which shifts attention toward understanding the individual rather than focusing on the harm caused. Another thing the media often does is create a kind of narrative arc around the shooter, almost like telling a story, with a beginning, middle, and end. While this makes the coverage more engaging, it can also shift the focus towards the shooter as a central figure. In many cases, Reporters spend a lot of time talking about the shooter's background, what they were like in school, their personality, and what they posted online. Meanwhile, victims are sometimes mentioned later or less in detail. The difference shows how attention isn't evenly distributed. Research found that media coverage often humanizes certain shooters by providing detailed backstories, especially in cases involving white male offenders. At the same time, when offenders are people of color, the media is more likely to focus on criminal behavior or use language that emphasizes danger rather than personal struggle. For example, when 12-year-old Tamir Rice was shot by police in Cleveland in 2014, some outlets referred to him as a black male with a gun, despite the gun being a toy. A supporting quote for this would be media narratives often construct mass shooters as troubled individuals rather than purely criminal actors. And this really matters because it affects how we assign blame and responsibility. If someone is framed as a troubled loner, people might feel sympathy or think the situation was unavoidable. But if someone is framed as a threat, the reaction is usually more focused on fear and punishment. It also raises questions about whose stories are considered important. When we hear more about the shooter than the victims, it can unintentionally send the message that the perpetrator's story mattered more. If you think about the last time you saw coverage of a mass shooting, you might remember details about the shooter, but not much about the victims. That's not random. That's a result of how the story was framed. So why do we feel like we understand some shooters more than others? Part of that answer connects to how these events are explained, and that brings us to mental illness. Before we move into mental illness, there's another layer we need to talk about: social media. Today, news spreads almost instantly through platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. That changes how people experience these events. Information can spread before it's verified, and emotionally intense content tends to travel faster. This means people might see partial information, rumors, or misleading headlines before the story is available. It also means that media framing isn't just coming from journalists anymore. It's coming from everyday users, influencers, and viral content. This adds another layer to how these events are understood and remembered. One of the most common explanations we hear after a mass or school shooting is that the shooter must have been mentally ill. In many recent cases, media coverage still quickly connects mass shootings to mental health. For example, after multiple recent incidents, reports immediately speculated about the shooter's mental state, even before confirmed information was available. Experts have pushed back on this pattern, noting that these assumptions can spread misinformation and reinforce stigma rather than explain the full situation. According to American Psychology Association, the vast majority of people with mental illnesses are not violent. In fact, they are more likely to be victims of violence rather than perpetrators. This shows that the connection between mental illness and mass shootings is often exaggerated in media coverage. A supporting quote for this could be, "The vast majority of individuals with mental illness do not engage in violent behavior." When the media focuses so heavily on mental illnesses, it can do a few things. First, it simplifies a really complex issue. Mass shootings don't usually just have one cause. They involve a mix of personal, social, and structural factors. Second, it can create stigma. People may start associating mental illnesses with danger, even though that's not accurate. And third, it can shift attention away from important factors like access to firearms, social influence, or warning signs that were ignored. It's important to recognize that while mental health can be a factor in some situations, it's often used as a main explanation way too quickly. This can lead to people believing that mass shootings are caused primarily by mental illness, when in reality, they are complex events with multiple contributing factors. The third major issue we're going to talk about is sensationalism. Basically, how these events are covered in ways that are intense, emotional, and sometimes overwhelming. Keeping this in mind, it's important to recognize that journalists are often working with limited information under tight deadlines, which can make balanced reporting more difficult. Mass and school shootings often receive nonstop media coverage. News outlets provide constant updates, repeated details over and over, and sometimes release information before it's fully confirmed. There's also a focus on dramatic elements like the number of victims, the timeline of events, and sometimes even graphic details. A recent attempted shooting at a major political event in 2026 received immediate high-intensity coverage across multiple news outlets. Reports focused heavily on the suspect's motivations, writings, and security concerns, with constant updates as new details emerged. This kind of rapid, ongoing coverage shows how quickly media attention can escalate and dominate the news cycle. Langford and Madfist suggest that this level of attention can contribute to what's called the copycat effect, where individuals may be influenced by the publicity surrounding previous attacks. A supporting quote would be, "Extensive media coverage can unintentionally provide recognition that some offenders seek." Another issue with sensationalism is how much attention is given to the shooter compared to the victims. In many cases, the shooter's name, face, and background are repeated constantly, while victims are mentioned briefly or later in the coverage. Additionally, the degree of salience and attention given to an event appears to also impact the likelihood of future events. Many media outlets have already begun to alter the way they cover incidents of mass violence, reducing coverage and images oriented around shooters, and instead placing significance on the victims. This can unintentionally give attention and recognition to the person who committed the act, which raises ethical concerns. It also shifts the focus away from the real impact on families, communities, and survivors. So when we put all this together, the stereotypes, the mental health framing, and the sensationalism, it starts to paint a bigger picture of how the media shapes our understanding. That's all for today's episode. I know this was a heavy topic, so I really appreciate you taking the time to listen and think through it with me. At the end of the day, mass and school shootings are complex events, but the way they're presented in the media can simplify them into patterns and narratives that aren't always accurate. By recognizing these patterns, we can become more aware of how our perceptions are shaped and maybe start asking better questions about what we're seeing and hearing. If you found this episode interesting, share it with someone else, or even just take a moment to reflect the next time you see news coverage of a major event. Ask yourself what's being emphasized, what's missing, and why. Thank you for listening.